Okay, this is episode 8 of the Fremzenek Podcast. So today we're doing it on supply side policies, and I'm joined by David Johnson. So if you'd like to introduce yourself again for the third time now.
Yes, hello. I'm David the Johnson. People call me David Johnson or just David or whatever. I'm fascinated with economics and international relations and other forms of social study and interdisciplinary analysis,
Hmm.
among other things.
So I think talking about supply side policy, we should just establish what it is for viewers who don't know, or maybe who do know, just need to rack their minds. So it's a policy generally aimed at increasing the productive capacity of the economy, but it also has these other benefits such as like reducing structural unemployment, increasing productivity, and reducing inflation. And reducing inflation part is mostly a result of the productive capacity. There's more output or there's more goods flowing in an economy, so you can buy more. Is the idea. So and then you would split supply side policy into two main branches: market based and interventionist. So I'll just give some examples. Market based, you talk about like tax cuts, deregulating the market, maybe privatizing public businesses. Whereas and interventionist is more hands on. It'd be
Yeah.
like the government investing in infrastructure or creating education programs or subsidizing R&D and things like this. So, you got anything to add on that?
No, I think you summed it up pretty succinctly. Though I will say, another important aspect of market-based policies is trade liberalization, which sort of goes hand in hand with the whole deregulation
Hmm.
concept that you were discussing. Um, but in general, I think that's kind of an important thing to mention, and it is relevant regarding some of my talking points. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
but we can. I have some case studies here that I'm about to jump into, and trade liberalization is a part of that.
Yeah, I wonder
So
if we have overlap.
Yeah, I'll just start on my main case study, which this is the case study I really wanted to talk about and what inspired this episode, which is Iceland. I find Iceland's supply side policy to be fascinating. So starting in I believe the early '60s, they immediately just like they identified that energy was going to be a hugely important sector for them, and as a result, they founded the Landsvirkjun, which was state owned and state funded, and the goal of this was to increase the energy capacity of Iceland, and this was mainly done through hydro dams initially, and a lot more recently, in the last 30 or so years, it's heavily taken advantage of geothermal to the extent where Iceland now is 100% renewable and also produces by far the most energy per capita of any other country. I mean, second place is the US, and it's not even close. Iceland, it's megawatts, several megawatts per person. It's such a vast amount of energy, and this has been a huge benefit to the Icelandic economy. And the fact that they're using geothermal and hydro is probably it is very future proof as well, right? It's probably one of the smartest investments as well. Hydro can last 50 to 100 years, sometimes even 100 plus years, depending on how well maintained it is. The second longest lasting energy source, which is nuclear, lasts at most 60 years. So hydro is very future proof. Even geothermal, which only lasts 30 to 50 years, is about equivalent to natural gas or coal, which lasts about 40 years. And on top of that is also, as I said, renewable, right? So you're never going to run out of it. It's more of a maintenance thing than you're going to run out of geothermal energy. So Iceland's investment is very future proof, and it's also been hugely beneficial. And the benefits is what I'm about to get into, which is that electricity is so cheap that they export aluminium. And this, on the surface, this doesn't seem like a big thing, but aluminium is one of the most energy intensive ores to process. So it comes from bauxite, and bauxite takes thousands, I believe it's 2.5 megawatts per ton, which is a lot of energy. And so, even though Iceland has no bauxite, its energy is so abundant and so cheap that it imports bauxite and exports aluminium because it can just undercut the competition in terms of ore processing. And now we're looking at things like data centers and other hugely energy-intensive industries. Iceland's economy is only looking stronger and stronger. So I think this is this is very clearly an interventionist policy. As I said, it was spearheaded by the Landsverken, which was run by the government. But I mean, it's a great example of smart government spending and smart future proofing, both in terms of the energy they're using as well as the industry they invested in, which was energy. So I think this is sort of like a sort of the golden child of interventionist supply side policies. Because I mean, Iceland's one of the highest GDP per capita countries in the world. It's got one of the highest quality of lives, and all of this on an island that realistically no one should actually feasibly be able to survive on. It's fascinating. So if you
Although I will say, you were talking a lot about the usage of geothermal energy and the amount of investment that the government put into that. I think it's interesting that that's something that that's not really applicable to any other country, and it's something that only can be done with Iceland. And I visited Iceland a few times, and it's a very small, as you were saying, very small island, and as you were saying, no one can feasibly live on there. And yet, I would say, and this goes back to what you were saying about the whole GDP per capita and the whole population. Uh, detail. The thing is with Iceland is that it's very concentrated and a very, very focused community. So it's very
hmm,
similar to a lot of Scandinavian countries as well,
yeah, but
like say Sweden or Norway.
the sparse population is certainly a benefit, right? When you have so
Yeah,
few people living in an area, it's very easy to build. Right? There's no NIMBYs, so it's
yeah.
that is sort of right. When I say it's the golden child of government intervention, there's a big caveat in that it's very easy to invest in geothermal because of Iceland's geography, and it's very easy to expand the electricity grid because of Iceland's geography. Iceland just has very good geography for this, but the fact that the government had the foresight to do this is sort of it's sort of impressive, right? Because I have some examples of other supply side interventionist policies which on paper seem to be equally as future proofed and yet did not um, pan out the way that it was thought to. Um,
But yeah, no, I'm in agreement with you in that regard, and I do think that as we're saying, Iceland has also invested in other forms of renewable energy, but the most crucial aspect here is the thing that we should be looking at the most is their long-term planning when it comes to supply side management, because that's really a key feature when it comes to like government spending in general that people often forget about is the long-term impacts, both positive and negative. Um, and I'll detail this in some of my other case studies, but it is something that is not talked about as much as it should. Um, but I don't know where I'm going with this. I'm just speaking out loud, thinking out loud.
Fair enough. I mean, yeah, just get your thoughts out. So
Yeah.
I'll transition now to Saudi Arabia, which is another success story, and an interventionist one, but in a very different way. Although arguably, again, it's down to their geography, right? There's a sort of a bit of a key theme here. So Saudi Arabia initially had a flux of investment from America in the 1950s, mostly in oil fields, and most of the profits that they got from this were immediately reinvested into expanding the oil fields. So they took the proceeds from the oil fields and then made more and then used that to get more oil and more oil and more oil until they were rich enough to comfortably be able to start funding other things. So this is sort of a good example of a country taking advantage of its natural resources, but not necessarily being exploited for their natural resources. And you can argue that may be down to Saudi Arabia being somewhat of a difficult country to invade, if you know what I mean, compared to other, very oil-rich countries. Very, very topical right now. Very oil-rich countries that are seemingly quite easy to invade and exploit. Cough, cough, Venezuela. But so I mean, this is an interesting one also because, of course, oil isn't like a universal good. Not every country has huge oil reserves. But equally so, not every country is basically completely a desert and so lacks any other form of economy. So this is what I'm going to get into. Saudi Arabia is now using their oil proceeds to diversify the economy. So they've invested in things like, hang on, let me find it here. Renewable energy, for example. and in Sudair City, which is just north of Riyadh, and also pharmaceuticals. So they're sort of they're future proofing their energy economy with solar panels, because again, this is linking back to geography, right? So, Saudi Arabia has a lot of sunlight, and so it is a very optimal place for solar panels. But equally so, because it's such a rich country now, they do have a very well-educated population, and so as a result, as I mentioned, they now have a pharmaceutical industry. So I think Iceland, it's sort of they've bagged on this one industry, and this one industry is very future-proof. Whereas Saudi Arabia, they've bagged on this one industry and then use that to diversify the economy to then future-proof it. So while both of these have been successful, they've been successful in different ways, and a lot of it is again down to their geography, but a lot of it is also down to the specific industries they've invested in. Although both invested in energy, both are unique in that they invested sort of in different ways and in different specializations down to their geographical location and the politics also. Of course, Saudi Arabia is very centralized. It's a monarchy and all these other things, whereas Iceland is, of course, is a democratic country. And I mean, Icelandic politics are very interesting. I believe they had a party that won that ran as a joke. Anything else to add?
No, I will say though, on the topic of supply side policies being used to control the energy uh, industry, and I'm going to go somewhere with this. I do want to talk a little bit about a market-based version, which is a success story, if you will, which is with the city-state of Singapore,
Mm,
which it initially began deregulating the electricity market in 2003, and that was done by the Energy Market Authority. This was done to sort of go against the state-owned electricity monopoly that was present in the area. Um, and instead of having the electricity industry completely controlled by one entity, that being the government, the Energy Market Authority, uh, quote unquote, unbundled the vertically integrated monopoly, which is to say, a monopoly that's, intrinsically tied together.
it
Am I making
controls
sense here?
all processes of the production line.
Yeah, that's what I mean to
Mm,
say. I'm sorry, it's been a long day, into separate entities for generation, transmission, and supply. And as a result, this was, it took some time. The liberalization of electric energy was implemented incrementally. But by 2018, consumers, households, and businesses of all different sizes could freely choose retailers. Now, of course, a lot of the same issues that are present when it comes to overly libertarian or free market ideas are still present here. So that's why regulatory measures were still taken to ensure that no natural monopolies or whatever would pop up.
yeah, certainly.
And
So I think,
yeah, and I have some interesting articles on that if you'd like to read that, like some papers and stuff, some research papers, which are
mm,
cool.
I mean, I could always link them in the description if viewers wanted to read more up on that. So yeah, I think again, this sort of links back to the idea that you need, like, you can have I mean, this is a market-based one, so I haven't specifically got into it, but I think this is another example of geography influencing the success of the supply side policy, right? Singapore, being a city-state and therefore being centralized, had this advantage of the fact that regulation is sort of quite easy to implement. It's not like a hugely arduous task to send someone to an energy production center to make sure it's all running smoothly and there's no embezzlement or things like that. But I mean, yeah, it's certainly an interesting case study. So I'll sort of transition to my market-based policies now. We'll just keep doing success stories then. So
I mean, I do have some failures if you're
yeah,
curious, but we'll
I do
save those for
equally
later.
so. But I was gonna do the success and failures of interventionism, but we'll just do all the successes. So I use
Interventionism.
Ireland here, and this is, so you mentioned at the very start of the episode with trade liberalization, and Ireland is a great example of this. In that, of course, they joined the EU, and that was a huge trade liberalization that opened up the Irish economy to all of Europe. And what's unique about the Irish economy is that they have a very, very low corporation tax. It's 12.5%. And also various incentives for TNCs, such as Apple, which is headquartered in Ireland, to invest in Ireland. And this is because they're in the EU. So they have very low, they have uniquely low taxes for an EU country, but are still in the EU, of course. So, companies can headquarter here, pay very little tax, but still have access to this huge free market of European goods, which is, that's sort of the driving factor behind Ireland's success rate. It's another geographical one, ironically. It found
Yeah.
itself in Europe. It's both geographical and governmental, right? The government had the foresight to take advantage of the low tax while its position in the EU was open. So yeah, and on top of that, right, we have to factor in, Ireland has a highly educated population, which also means like it's very easy to set up shop in Ireland, right? You already have this high skill worker base to take advantage of as well. So this is less of a a planned thing and more of a it's sort of look. It was certainly undeniably the government played a role in this by having low taxes and everything, but it's sort of just look that Ireland was in the EU. If you could very easily imagine, say, Portugal doing an equally as successful measure. Of course, Ireland was just the first to do it and took advantage of it, and that's success, right? A lot of these success stories are that these countries were the first countries to take advantage of whatever specialization they had.
I would say it's also that, and as we're saying, it's a lot of the geographical aspects that are in play. As we were saying, the fact that all of these examples that we mentioned, um, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, are all relatively small countries. Well, I don't think Ireland's that small, but again, relatively, that sort of leads to a much more successful case because you have, I would say, less of a margin of error. And as we're saying with Ireland, with the high amount of education, and you could sort of say the same with Iceland as well. As I don't know how educated Iceland is, but it's a very small
Yeah,
country, so I'd
I
imagine,
believe when they started the Landsverken investment, it was actually quite like not uneducated, but it was an economy based around fishing and the likes, and it's sort of a chicken and egg situation, right? Like they did have some educational facilities, but obviously the proceeds from the Landsverken and the government revenue significantly
yeah.
helped with that.
Yeah, I do think that because when I went to Iceland, all the people seemed very smart, but I haven't actually checked like what are the average like literacy rates or whatever there. Um, but anyway, what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, if we're talking more interventionist, I'd like to broaden a bit and talk
Mm.
about another decent success story, which was, and this is a big country, China's new, well, relatively new, it was like 10 years ago, economic policy agenda. They refer to it as the supply side structural reform. And the whole thing was it was meant to not only deal with all of the longer term economic issues that were in place in China at the time, but also to improve and invest into infrastructure. So sort of working as like a bit of a stimulus package, if you will. It's also allowed for research and development as well, which is another crucial aspect of interventionist supply side policies,
Mm.
manufacturing, and all of these things. But, because the Chinese economy is very dependent on exports, but a lot of investment also needs to go into improving the domestic, like just improving quality of life, the infrastructure,
Mm.
data centers,
And if you
telecommunications.
look at, so just to butt in, if you look at China's air quality, it's improved dramatically in the last 10 years. So,
Yeah,
you can sort of already see the payoffs of this investment into, carbon capture infrastructure like their anti-desertification they have in the Gobi Desert. They also have, I believe, they've been focusing a lot on noise pollution. If you look at noise barriers being built globally. Almost all of it is in China. China is taking leaps and bounds into investing in quality of life and things like that, which is, I think, arguably one of the more underappreciated supply side policies. Because increasing quality of life has been shown to massively increase productivity while also costing very, very little. You think about productivity increases; it's usually these huge, technological developments. When realistically, you could improve green space a little bit, and productivity can rise equally as much as these huge technological investments. So I think China's investment into these, underappreciated sectors is it shows their foresight. But on
Uh,
infrastructure,
no,
I
anyway,
actually was going
before
to
you
mention
get to that
Japan.
point, I know, but before you get to that point, I do want to
Mm,
mention I do think it is interesting that and I'm this is purely anecdotal, but I don't live in China. I live in the Western world, and from what I've been seeing, there seems to be a bit of a transition into Chinese manufactured electric vehicles or EVs, if you will.
mm.
Because I'm not even going to try to get into the stuff that happened with Elon Musk and Tesla, but I feel as though, considering its shoddy quality, with regards to stuff like the Cybertruck and a lot of the controversial aspects of Musk as a
See,
character.
Tesla's a unique one for China as well, because Tesla was one of the first automobile manufacturers to be allowed into China. That was allowed to fully retain its ownership of the Tesla factory. Although as a result, they sort of spearheaded the EV market in China, which is now called it is sort of this they call it a goose effect, right? You look at
Yeah.
geese flying, and you have like a spearhead goose and the ones flowing behind it. So in this case, the spearhead goose would be Tesla, and you have like BYD and the likes flying behind it, which has taken advantage of Tesla's sort of piercing into the market.
And
Um,
I would say, in the long run, maybe in a few years, some of the Chinese EVs could overtake Tesla in popularity.
that's assuming. See, this is the other thing we were talking about. Barriers. Oh, sorry. Trade liberalization, and this is one of the things is you take that assumption, but the US and the EU have both put huge tariffs on Chinese EVs. The UK uniquely hasn't, so your prediction may be correct for the UK, but so far for the EU and the US, it looks like Chinese EVs may have huge barriers to entry for those countries, and that arguably is a failure on the US and the EU. Um, because they're so adamant in protecting their domestic car industries, despite the fact their domestic car industries are so ingrained in fossil fuels and things like this.
Yeah.
And
Although I will
you can
say,
also make the argument that that's a failure on the European and the US car manufacturers for not diversifying into electric vehicles enough. You look at a lot of the electric vehicles built by BMW and the likes, and a lot of them are sort of they're luxury electric vehicles rather than practical electric vehicles. And I feel
yeah.
that's the distinction for Chinese manufacturers. They sort of took electric vehicles and made them practical rather than a sort of a status symbol.
Yeah, and it's kind of upsetting when something like the Tesla, and I'm speaking from like a couple years ago when, because I've ridden in a Tesla before, not mine obviously, but
Mm,
it's really neato and stuff. It's really awesome, great views. But I feel as though there's too much of an emphasis on the superficiality of it all, for lack of a better word.
mm,
Um, yeah, where, as you were saying, and America's kind of obsessed with this, when it comes to its manufacturing, which is understandable considering that uh, status and the brand recognition is kind of a huge driver in terms of sales and consumer retention. Um, but like when you take a look at something else that's luxurious, like say Rolex, it does functionally the same things as every other watch, but it has not only the branding but also all of these additional, kind of unnecessary features that propel it to the status that it is. And the same can be said with Tesla. I think part of it is it functionally the whole renewable energy aspect to it, the whole electric vehicle thing, it works fine, but I think a lot of the prices are being jacked up due to a need to make it sort of like a status symbol.
yeah. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, just using a Rolex example, just to build on that. I mean, the Rolex example is good, but just to sort of drive home the point about EVs is that we undeniably, other than hydrogen, we need EV cars to mitigate the climate crisis. So it's like the irony is that the EU and the US, or I'll use the EU because the EU is especially more in tune with the climate crisis. The US is sort of veered off. more recently, but the EU, who is so, they're so adamant about their climate targets, and yet they've almost commodified this idea of carbon neutrality, right? They've made carbon neutrality more of a luxury than something out of practicality, which is ironically the opposite of what China's done. China's made carbon neutral things like renewable energy, like EV cars, more of a practical thing. Rolling us back now to China's investment in infrastructure, I'm going to talk about Japan, and this is and I see a lot of parallels between what Japan did in the 90s and the 2000s with infrastructure and what China is doing now. And so Japan in the 90s and 2000s sort of entered this period of stagnation, which it still is in today, although less so actually. Japan is for the first time ever actually experiencing some level of inflation, which is very interesting. But nonetheless, so what happened is it entered this period of stagnation, and the government tried to dig itself out. It didn't accept it, unlike it has now. It didn't accept that it was in stagnation. So what they did was they heavily invested in infrastructure. They built roads, bridges, tunnels, airports, etc., all around the country, especially so in rural areas, to sort of try and generate it, because Tokyo was already so well developed that it was very, very difficult to improve on it. So they spent huge amounts of money in rural areas, and as a result, debt to GDP spiked to 200%, where it still sits about today. It's even higher now. I believe 240%. It might be a bit higher. And it was ultimately a big failure because they built all this infrastructure, but it was in rural areas, and so no one was there to use it. So they built they built all of this productive capacity, but there was no demand to use it, and so as a result, there wasn't any economic growth because there was no actual benefit. It wasn't benefiting anyone. It just existed. It was a very brief benefit, right? They employed people to build these things, and so there was a certainly an increase in GDP, but that's more because the government spent all of this money, and less so the productive capacity of the economy actually increased. I mean, if you think about how much money they spent on just infrastructure in rural areas, they could have spent that elsewhere in, like R&D, education, advanced manufacturing, etc., which would actually increase the productive capacity of the economy. I feel this was just a huge failure on Japan's part to not recognize that it did have a declining population. It's failed to recognize that the infrastructure was realistically leading to nowhere, or at least nowhere valuable, right? It was all rural agricultural areas, which generally aren't developed. You would more want it to lead to brownfield sites, which Japan sort of lacks due to the fact that almost all the brownfield sites have been urbanized. So I feel like this is, unlike Iceland, this is an example where the government just completely lacked the foresight and awareness. They sort of ran on this idea that, if we build and spend enough, the economy is just going to grow. When that isn't strictly the truth, you need that demand. Arguably, you can make the case that Iceland took a gamble. They built all this energy, assuming that demand would exist, and demand did exist. In the form of bauxite processing, in the form of data centers, in the form of all these other things. But energy is a much more useful thing, right, compared to infrastructure. And this is what I was getting to, is that I see a lot of parallels with China here. China's not necessarily in a phase of stagnation, quite the opposite. Their exports reached an all-time high as of last year, but they are on the brink of a declining population, which is what Japan had in this period. And they are massively increasing infrastructure spending. China has built and is still building mass amounts of high-speed rail. China is still building huge amounts of highways. And I think most importantly, there is a lot of airport and airway expansion in China. China is hugely investing into its local aeronautical industries. Of course, it's not quite caught up to Boeing and Airbus yet, but I can see that happening. But as I've said, it is on the brink of population decline, and I believe it is starting to have population decline. So I can very much see China falling into this Japan situation where they are building roads to nowhere, or at least building roads to nowhere where people exist or live, to fill in these infrastructure projects, to use these infrastructure projects to actually benefit from these infrastructure projects. So it's yet to be seen if that does play out, but I do see a lot of parallels between them. And China's debt to GDP is growing, undeniably. And if you and this is the other thing is you look at China's local authorities, and the local authorities have a lot of debt, and so there's sort of this hidden debt that the local authorities have, that arguably puts China in the same spot that Japan was in. We just don't see it because the debt is sort of hidden in these bureaucratic institutions.
I think the way you put it with, China's building roads to nowhere, or China could end up building roads to nowhere, is a very, very vivid way of putting it. Although I do just want to continue with this, since we're doing sort of a deep dive in Asia, another form of an interventionist supply side policy, sort of a success story as well, is with and this is a more recent. This was South Korea's sophisticated research and development tax credit system,
Mm.
which not necessarily infrastructure, but was basically imposed to, sort of subsidize and get rid of some of the burdens that come with research and development, usually in the form of just like tax credit. So what it does is, you might be a little bit curious, and rest assured, I'm going to explain it to you. You probably already know this, but companies can elect to claim a tax credit on a research and development expenditure. So I don't know, maybe could be something biomedical, could be something more, um, you know, um, something more to do with I don't know, like trying to think like manufacturing technology or whatever. I'm just thinking of examples off the top of my head. Now, of course, the rates will vary, but what it's supposed to do is it offers a bit of a tax relief for development of those products. And again, these rates are often increasing as a result of a bunch of tax reform proposals. And um, yeah, sorry. So, what was I gonna say? So I'm just looking at some of the notes I have here. So the like general baseline research and development credit rates are uh, are typically 12%, for smaller firms, but for much larger ones, and again, the numbers vary. It's around 3%. And this research, sorry, this investment goes to all sorts of research. Like as I was saying, semiconductors, advanced biotechnology, AI research, manufacturing,
And
all
you
that
could also
jazz.
argue that this supply side policy, this market based supply side policy, which is what it is, it's a tax cut, right, has only been successful because of prior interventionist supply side policies. As you mentioned, right, they're investing in
Yeah,
semiconductors and all of these things, and that's only because it has a high skilled workforce, and that's because South Korea did do a lot of interventionist investment into education, into getting this quaternary industry for R&D to be achievable and things like that. So
yeah,
this is sort of an interesting one where it's like they implemented initially they implemented interventionist supply side policies to get the economy up to scratch, and then once it was up to scratch, they sort of eased the economy into more of a free market operation.
yeah.
Once it was competitive enough, which is arguably sort of what China's doing, not to a much lesser extent. I keep going back to China, but it's just an interesting one. It's been in the news a lot. China has had this huge investment into the quaternary industry, and now it's sort of, relaxing on the rules and allowing its companies to get more competitive with one another. I don't know how well versed you are in Chinese news, or how well versed the viewers are in Chinese news, but there's
Well,
been
I
this,
will
there's been
say,
a delivery company war recently in China between the three main, I forget their names, but there's the three main delivery companies, who they're like the Uber Eats and the Deliveroo of China, and they've all been fighting for who can get the lowest, so the cheapest delivery costs and things like that. So China's sort of eye-wateringly competitive economy is sort of rearing its head now, and we're sort of seeing not we already saw sort of a capitalization of China, but now we're seeing the free marketization, I suppose.
But wait, no, just to go back to what you were saying. The three major Chinese delivery platforms that you were talking about,
Mm,
they are Taobao, Meituan, and Jingdong.
mm,
With Mei Meituan, delivery platform has a share of 65% in the Chinese food delivery business. So I would say it kind of is the majority stake holder. Um, but the other two have definitely shown to be worthy competitors,
mm,
and I feel like that sort of helps encourage a lot of competition and promotes choice,
mm.
um, you know, within the economy.
So I'll move on to New Zealand now. As New Zealand
Yeah,
is a really interesting example where market based. So they did have okay, this is actually a good contrast with South Korea. South Korea had this interventionist policy where they did get the economy up to scratch. They got this education, they got all of this, and then allowed the market based policies to sort of ease in and continue the economic growth. New Zealand did sort of similar. They had these interventionist policies, but it failed spectacularly once they implemented market based policies. So in 1984, New Zealand had high tariffs on agricultural products, but also high subsidies on domestic agricultural businesses. But then in 1984, the new government who was elected in allowed the New Zealand dollar to float freely on the foreign exchange markets, and then immediately cut all tariffs on agricultural products as well as all subsidies. And this was sort of a shock therapy to the agricultural industry, which was highly productive, but suddenly was flooded with really, really cheap imports, especially from like Southeast Asian countries at the time, which were equally as agricultural based. Not less so in the modern day. In the modern day, New Zealand has a larger agricultural economy than these Southeast Asian countries, and that's primarily down to New Zealand having a very agricultural oriented geography, while these Southeast Asian countries have focused more on manufacturing. But anyway, the
goes
point
back to
being
what you
is
were saying.
this was a failure in terms of like labor unions were weakened significantly, so wages also fell for the farm hands, and GDP stagnated for years and years, and didn't start growing until the mid 90s, and that's because of it cost the government more on unemployment benefits than it was initially costing them on subsidies. So government spending was actually increased as a result, and the competitiveness of their exports, which were competitive, were actually reduced because of imports coming into the economy, which sort of muddied down the sort of the base load of demand that you sort of need for agricultural industries. You need that subsistence to keep enough demand going, for exports to also be possible, right? So I think this could have been a success. And it has been a success, right? New Zealand is now an agricultural net exporter. It punches way above its weight in terms of productivity, etc. But it's just the fact that they did it all at once. And I think this is sort of a thing about market-based policies. It's more of a long-term thing. You need to ease into it. Whereas New Zealand did it all at once. And we'll also see this with Russia. I'll get into Russia's shock therapy, which is even more interesting because it went from sort of a complete command economy to almost a complete free market, sort of unintentionally. But so yeah, this is sort of the point I wanted to make with this episode, is that the success of these policies is dependent on the geography and the politics, but also on the time scale. You have these interventionist policies which tend to work better on a short-term scale, or at least a short-term scale once they're implemented, right? With interventionist policies like education, there's of course a time lag, but once that time lag's over, it's almost instant. Whereas a market-based one, it's sort of the negative effects are felt almost immediately, unlike an interventionist one. So it's sort of to break it down, right? Supply side policies are heavily influenced by the geography, the politics, and the time scale. It's sort of an ultimate point I'm making, but I'll jump into Russia, unless you want to mention something now.
Well, no, it's just, you were saying about how like market-based policies, are statistically more prone to failure due to the deregulated nature of them. I'm interested in
Yeah,
hearing your
they're
take
far
about
more
Russia.
unpredictable.
Yeah, but still, they're more risky.
Yeah, because of their unpredictable
Yeah,
nature, was my point. Yeah.
yeah. No, I wanted to add on to that, but talk about Russia first. This is sort of tangentially related.
Yeah. So obviously, Russia was initially the Soviet Union in 1991 before it fell, and so then it transitioned to become Russia. And see, this is an interesting thing. Actually, Gorbachev initially wanted Georgism to be implemented in Russia, and they'd have a land value tax and all these things. And the biggest Soviet economists argued for Georgism, as even Lenin quoted Georgism to be the best form of capitalism. It fell through for whatever reason. I won't get into details because it riles me up. But so anyway, Russia transitioned into this free market economy under the leadership of Boris Yeltsin, and Boris Yeltsin and his team of economists thought that there'd be a couple months where prices are fluctuating massively because there's no more price controls, there's no more state-led economy. But then they thought, once all the prices are reallocated, investment will start flowing, there'll be more liquidity, and the economy will really start pumping. In reality, that did not happen. Liquidity collapsed and various other things, and this is what I'll get into. So the main reasons it failed here was, again, like New Zealand, it just all happened at once. You suddenly, everything was privatized, and on that, actually, it was privatized specifically to oligarchs, which isn't inherently a bad thing, assuming that those oligarchs do reinvest their money. But they didn't, right? The oligarchs used the money to just profiteer and make money for themselves and didn't particularly reinvest it into the business or the economy as a whole. And as a result, imports spiked, but exports stayed essentially stagnant, right? Because you had all of these oligarchs getting all this money from the industries that they suddenly were able to just buy out entirely. But they weren't reinvesting the profits. They were just using the profits to, buy yachts and things like that from overseas countries. So it was a complete failure because all it did was sort of shift wealth, which was very evenly distributed initially, upwards into a small fraction of people who obviously, the Soviet Union didn't produce that many luxury goods. So, when you have a suddenly very rich but small section of a population, they're going to want a lot of luxury goods. So the failure here was that, the exports didn't increase, but imports did, and the economy didn't really adjust until 10, 15 years down the line, once investment was made, once banks were properly set up, and once liquidity was actually flowing around the economy and not just concentrated in these oligarchs, while the rest of the country was just sort of impoverished. And even looking at lifespans, right? The average lifespan of a Russian collapsed by about 15 to 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's one of the, not just one of the biggest economic tragedies, one of the biggest human tragedies, right? The millions, hundreds of millions of people were affected by the fall of the Soviet Union. And you can argue that all of these ex-Soviet countries, Lithuania, Latvia, etc., they all benefited from this, and that's undeniable, right? But I think a lot of it gets down to the fact that the countries that immediately got these strong institutions and fought off corruption and fought off they initially fought off the upwards flow of wealth distribution. They've benefited, right? As I said, the Baltic states, a shining example of a post-Soviet country that are now very advanced and took full advantage of the free market once they could. Whereas Russia didn't do this, and you can argue that's on Yeltsin for not having the foresight. He thought it would only be a brief period of stagnation and then it'd be fine. Completely untrue. Although you could also argue that's a failure on the government for being too weak and not implementing things, because the government was extremely, extremely weak, and a lot of it, this is more of a politics than an economics thing. A lot of the government was sort of under the control of the Russian mafia, and that's another issue of corruption, right? So, it was sort of just a huge culmination of failures. It happened too fast. It was the economists of Russia were far too wishful in their thinking, and they didn't really think about the wealth distribution, nor did they think about incentives for investment. They just assumed the free market would invest, which isn't strictly true. And the like, especially, you have to think, transitioning from a command economy where luxury goods are almost non-existent to a free market where you can suddenly import all the luxury goods you want. Of course, this small subset of people who are suddenly very, very rich are immediately going to want to splurge out on as many luxury goods as they can. And so again, it's a lot of these, and this one especially, it's a failure of having foresight, whereas the successful ones is a success in having foresight, which is sort of very interesting.
I will say though, on the topic, this is a bit of a, tangent, but on the topic of countries that were economically just destroyed by the collapse of the Soviet Union, take a look over there at Albania. Within like few years, it just completely collapsed to like this anarchist state. Um, where like establishment schools, hospitals, they were all like vandalized, um and there was a lot of weaponry all around, because people in Albania had been trained from a young, when they were occupied by the Soviet Union,
Hmm.
uh to be good with weaponry and to basically have military training.
Sort of a little fun
And
fact also, Albania has the highest amount of bunkers per capita of any country in the world.
doesn't
Just a fun
surprise
fact.
me.
Hmm.
Yeah, no, they are very messed up, and I was reading a bit about how their economy was just completely annihilated as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union. And it's something that I would say has gotten better in the past few years. But yeah, for a period of time, for like an entire decade, I would say, Albania was a very impoverished place, if I'm making sense. That was sort of negatively affected.
Yeah, I mean, visit again. It's sort of everything happened too fast, and there's this sort of, again, it's this perfect storm of horrible things that all happened at once. I'll talk about Brazil now, and Brazil has many interesting things. We could talk about Brazil's market-based economics as well, supply-side policies as well. But Brazil is very interesting in that its interventionist policies on paper should have worked very well, but were a complete failure. And this is down to the political institutions. So in 2000s, Brazil invested heavily into the Brazilian Development Bank, while also raising tariffs to protect their domestic industries. So they were sort of they sort of raised tariffs and then invested in their infant businesses, which were protected by the tariffs, to sort of create a stronger domestic manufacturing economy. But of course, these high tariffs also meant that these infant businesses had really zero incentive to innovate, because Brazil is a huge country with a huge population, so it was already a large domestic market. So it had no real reason to become internationally competitive, rather just domestically competitive. But it didn't need to become domestically competitive because it was just getting bankrolled by the government, by the Brazilian Development Bank. So that's sort of why it was a failure, but that isn't the only reason why it was a failure. Because, I'll just give an example here. The Petrobras, which was an oil company set up by the Brazilian government, it was a planned offshore expansion of oil drilling. But and on paper, they should have been hugely successful. Oil was very expensive at the time and continues to be a very lucrative commodity to sell. But the main reason it failed was because of corruption and embezzlement of funds, which led to costs exploding massively and delays in the development time, because there simply wasn't the money there to start getting workers on the ground or in the sea, because it's offshore drilling. So as a result, it was a complete failure, even though on paper it should have been one of the easiest things ever. It's the oil industry is laughably easy to get into as long as you have a drill and a ship to export the oil, but it failed because of corruption. The steel and automotive industry, which we're heavily invested in, do still exist and are actually very large today, but they aren't internationally competitive. And this is because the tariffs, as I mentioned beforehand, they still exist in the modern day. And as I mentioned beforehand, the domestic economy is still very strong. There's still a large amount of population and demand, which keeps these industries alive. So while Brazil uniquely does have a large automotive and a steel industry, it's not competitive. And you can make arguments about would Brazil benefit from dropping the tariffs and just getting cheaper cars and cheaper steel? or is the employment gain from that, more benefiting the economy? It's quite an interesting one. Although I must give a caveat. They did one hugely successful investment, and this was into the agricultural business. But this is getting back to the geography, right? Brazil has the perfect geography for agriculture. Huge rainforest, which is very easy to slash and burn, and therefore also has very, very fertile soil after the fact because of the biosphere. So
Yeah.
Brazil invested heavily into the agricultural business, and as a result, it's one of the biggest agricultural exporters. But Brazil has always specialized in agriculture, so it was already a fairly innovative business or industry for them. And I mean, also, agriculture tends to be a very low profit margin business. So while it was a success story, it wasn't like a macroeconomic success story because it wasn't to a large benefit to the economy. You know, unlike potentially the automotive or the steel industry that they do have. If that did take off and that did innovate and that did become internationally competitive, Brazil could be a high income country. But instead it's sort of fallen into this trap of just becoming an agricultural based economy because it was the easy option to do.
Yeah, kind of like a poverty cycle, if you will, but
Mm,
not quite, considering that it's on a more macroeconomic level.
yeah.
Sorry, international, I would say. It's a
Mm.
more appropriate term.
I only have one country case study left, so if you want to
Oh, well, I
sort of,
wanted to get to one. It's a big
yeah.
one. It's a market-based one. This one's a pretty big failure, and I'm surprised you didn't mention it. It is or it was the U.S. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was something Trump introduced in his first year, and it reduced tax rates and personal exemptions for individuals and corporations. So the idea, much like a lot of conservative economics, and same thing happened with Reagan, um, was they said the Council of Economic Advisors basically said that the benefits of the act would trickle down across the U.S. economy, going from, like the most elite down to the bottom and sort of benefiting everyone across each level, um, each class. Um, but this instead only exacerbated inequality and added more to the U.S. federal debt, which is
Mm,
kind of a common trend, it seems, with regards to Trumponomics.
yeah.
But according to the Center for American Progress, this tax cut was, predictably overly skewed towards the wealthy. The top 1% of the income received a third of the corporate tax reduction, but 20% of the reduction from all the measure's provisions. So what this basically means is that despite what economic officials were saying, that the average household would conservatively realize an increase in wage and salary income of $4,000 as a result of a lower corporate tax rate, instead there was much more benefits going directly towards the people on the top, and everyone else didn't really have as much of a benefit because there was no trickling down, and a lot of the tax cuts were not dedicated. If you're putting, and this is kind of a huge issue, I would say, with like late stage capitalism, but
Mm.
if you're putting corporations on like the same level as individuals and treating them as equals,
See, this is
then
the
that's
other
only
thing. Even saying that individual income tax is significantly higher than corporation tax, at least in the UK and the US, which is what we're
well,
talking
yeah,
about.
yeah, I know.
So, even
But
talking
I
about
mean,
treating them as individuals, they're treated even better than individuals.
well, I mean, the fact that that's even happening is, kind of absurd because and it's not just with taxation, in general, corporations sort of have a lot of the same liability and the same, uh, like, rights and rules that individuals have.
Hmm.
And I don't know, I don't feel right about that. It doesn't feel, you
Well, it's
know,
it's sort of getting into the idea of Strathian economics and the idea that you have sort of this sliding scale or this yeah it's sort of, so you have two variables is one of the ideas postulated in Strathian economics that you have wages and you have profit, and so as you increase profit, wages tend to go down generally. So talking about cutting corporation tax and cutting these other incentives for paying employees better, which we saw under Reagan and obviously as you mentioned Trump.
Yeah.
It's sort of, it is very interesting that Straffian economics predicted this in the 60s and the 70s before Reaganomics and Trumponomics came in. That as profits tend to increase and or as profit margins increase, wages tend to fall or at least stagnate relatively to that. And again, we have seen that corporation taxes are at an all-time low, but wage growth is not too high. Productivity isn't too high, etc. Right? We're seeing a huge growth in, or theoretical growth in, company profitability, but we aren't seeing that much growth on the worker end. And I think that's one of the real insights that Straffian economics gives you. In terms of it sort of looks at how wages interact with profits, and it's very interesting. It's just sort of a recent interest of mine, and it's very applicable to this.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think that's relevant. What else do I have here? Oh yeah, not only did this heavily slow down corporate investment, despite the fact that the Council of Economic Advisors stated that it would increase exponentially.
see, this is hang
It
on. So I
also
just I just want to butt in because this is one of the fundamental things I don't understand. Is a corporation tax is levied purely on company profits, but company profits exclusively go to shareholders, right? They could withhold those profits and instead invest it into R&D and other things, which would actually be to the benefit of the company. But instead they aren't, and obviously instead they're profiting from it. So this is one of the fundamental things. This might be showing my lack of knowledge on the area, but I feel like reducing corporation taxes when they're levied on profits, it doesn't make much sense. Surely a higher corporation tax would incentivize more investment because a company doesn't want as much profits because profits aren't as lucrative compared to spending it on, say, R&D or better wages for workers to increase productivity or etc.
yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of the antithesis to what we were saying with regards to South Korea, where, instead of putting the money that's used from cutting these taxes into research and development and directly putting it into funding and corporate investment, it's instead put into the pockets of people who already have too much, thus again exacerbating the wealth gap. Um, Although I was also going to add that, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, it also widened the trade deficit a bit. Although, because another one of the things that the Council of Economic Advisors and the Center, another thing that the Council of Economic Advisors said was that a corporate tax cut to 20% would dramatically reduce the trade deficit and increase GDP accordingly. That was not the case, and instead that led to not only a trade deficit, but also a decrease in GDP
It's
due
sort of a
to
Russia
a lack of
situation, isn't it?
yeah,
As I mentioned
yeah, lack
earlier,
of
you
consumer
you
spending, lack of business investment, just a lack of activity.
yeah, you enrich
Because every
people, and as a result, they're going to want to spend it, but they're going to spend it on luxury goods. Which, I mean, of course, you can build luxury goods domestically. Undeniably, the US does build a lot of luxury goods domestically, but not all of that is going to be domestically, and consumption is going to rise as a result. So you're almost undeniably going to have an increase in imports if you enrich your local population, but you're not going to have an increase in exports because enriching your local population isn't going to increase exports. What increases exports is increasing your output, but tax cuts don't necessarily do that. Tax cuts just enrich people.
yeah, yeah, and it is kind of frustrating that it's essentially put under the guise of being something that will trickle down and help everybody, and that's part of the reason why Trump has so much support from people with much lower incomes and people who live in more rural areas because they bought into the idea of trickle down economics.
Yeah, there's that fundamental information gap that they just don't understand
Yeah,
the
asymmetric
implications.
information.
Hmm. So I'll just get into my last case study now, unless you have more to add on the US.
No, now you can go.
Okay, so this is the UK. This is sort of I mean, I'm by no means do I support Thatcher, and you can argue this is more of a technological thing, rather than anything else. But it was successful initially, um, and it continues to be successful. So what happened in, I believe it was 1986, Thatcher abolished fixed fees for trade commissions and instead made them negotiable, which reduced costs for investors and led to more efficient markets because fees were less distortive because they were, they were scalable to the size of a trade. So this made investment banking much more lucrative. And, this is arguably an interventionist policy in terms of this aspect, but electronic screens were added to the trading floor, and this sped up the rate at which stocks were traded and ownership exchanged hands and things like that. So this really it added grease to the stock market, right? It really sped it up, and then the markets were deregulated, but not in like the traditional sense. It was more that it's more of a trade liberalization idea, right? So what happened is stockbrokers initially could only be individuals and a lot of time could only be UK residents. But instead, it was opened up to be owned by corporations and not just domestic corporations, but international corporations. It sort of professionalized the UK stock market, really. Major at the time, obviously Japan was also a large economy, so major US and Japanese banks could finally buy into the UK stock market, and so as a result, you did have a large inflow of capital, which the UK desperately needed at the time. So, I mean, as much as I'm opposed to Thatcher's policy of privatization and things like, the opening up of the UK economy was one of probably honestly the best things she did. Arguably, she didn't do a whole great deal of good in my eyes, but
And similar thing
opening up the
with
market
Reagan.
and trade liberalization was undeniably a good thing.
Yeah, the whole neoliberal approach to it definitely benefited both the U.S. and the UK economies respectively. But the thing I would say with regards to the neoliberal approaches of the 80s is that they definitely opened up, a lot of trade relations and a lot of connections between countries. But I would also say it led to consequences like Black Monday,
Mm,
and like the whole conceit of institutions and establishments being too big to fail. Like a house of cards, if you will.
yeah.
They expanded the American and the British metaphorical empires so much that they ended up sort of collapsing a little bit under their own weight.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you can make the argument that I mean, this isn't. I mean, the UK didn't cause Black Monday, but obviously, like the UK stock market, for example, by opening up internationally in 1986, and then Black Monday was in 1987. I mean, there's something to be said there, right? You can argue that the sort of the liberalization of the stock market was 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 the cause behind Black Monday. So
And
I'll just wrap it up. So I think well, obviously we've discussed a lot of different aspects of supply side policies. We've discussed a lot of case studies, and just to boil it down, I mentioned this earlier, right? But you have sort of the three main aspects behind the success of supply side policies, right? You have the geography of the area, what natural resources are available, what's the terrain like, how habitable is the terrain, etc. You have the politics. Do you have a strong government, or do you have a small but strict government like we have like you see in Singapore, or a large but sort of looser government like you see in China, etc. And then you also have a time scale. Are you investing on a long-term time scale? Are you trying to sort of cause a surge in demand to fight against deflation like we saw in Japan, etc. There's a lot of aspects, and there's a lot of nuance to supply side policies, and I think a lot of it is down to how sustainable is it, and a lot of the time it isn't necessarily sustainable, especially market based approaches, because a free market is arguably inherently not necessarily sustainable because of wealth distribution. So yeah, I mean that's about it. Unless you have any final comments.
no, I don't have any final comments. I feel like we covered most of the examples of supply side policies, the interventionist, the free market based, the good, the bad, and where this could go in the future. So I would say this has been an interesting conversation.